They say you can tell a lot about a person by the company they keep, but you can also tell a lot about a company by the evil backstories they keep under wraps. So today, let's take a look at 5 companies with surprisingly dark pasts. Now obviously a lot of companies have done some bad things. Maybe even most companies. Perhaps even all companies. So I'm not going to include every evil corporation, because if I made a video about all the companies that have used child labor or slave labor, we'd be here for 6 hours. And I'm also trying not to include dark pasts that are common knowledge. I think most of us know that Volkswagen was created by the Nazis. Although I should give Volkswagen an honorable mention for still doing evil things well into the 21st century. I've also tried to focus on brands that you might not expect to have some skeletons in the closet, since I doubt anyone thinks BP is nourishing the planet. And of course, I'm only including stuff that's actually interesting, as I always try to bore you guys as little as possible. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. Kicking off the list, we have Warner Brothers. And no, it's not just the fact that they greenlit the Space Jam sequel. This is easily the least dark entry on the list, but Warner Brothers was once completely owned by the New Jersey mob. The story starts with a man named Manny Kimmel, who worked as an illegal bookie in the early 20th century. He eventually entered the parking garage business, and when the Prohibition rolled around, he began leasing out his garages to Abner Zwillman, a mobster from New Jersey. Zwillman would smuggle alcohol into the United States through Canada using armored trucks from World War I. Then he would store the liquor in Kimmel's garages before distributing it. He later expanded his operation into illegal gambling, prostitution, and racketeering, causing the press to dub him the Al Capone of New Jersey. He was also known as Longy, making him the first mobster to have a nickname that sounds like both a male porn star and a kid's imaginary friend. In 1945, Manny Kimmel consolidated his garage operations and created the Kinney Parking Company, with Abner Zwillman being a part owner. The business flourished, eventually expanding into rental car services and funeral homes, just in case anyone was doubting that it was owned by the mob. In 1959, Abner Zwillman was found dead on the day that he was going to testify before a Senate committee on organized crime. The official ruling was that he had hanged himself, conveniently choosing to do so right before he was going to give the government valuable information about mob activity. Police also found bruises on Zwillman's wrists, so I guess he decided to tie himself up shortly before jumping into a noose. But even without Longy, business was booming for the Kinney Parking Company. By 1964, they had a fleet of 6,000 rental cars and were generating $29 million in sales. In 1966, they merged with a company called the National Cleaning Contractors Incorporated, which somehow sounds even more like a money laundering operation than the Kinney Parking Company. The new organization was called Kinney National Company. The CEO was a man named Steve Ross, who got the gig because he was the son-in-law of one of Manny Kimmel's colleagues who owned the Kinney funeral homes. Meanwhile, the movie studio Warner Brothers had been struggling tremendously, failing to put out a major box office hit in several years. So in 1969, the Kinney National Company, which got their start doing illegal alcohol storage for the mafia, bought the entirety of Warner Brothers. And they actually did a really good job running it, turning the studio around with a string of box office hits. In 1972, it was discovered that the Kinney National Company had been price-fixing their parking operations. To get out of the scandal, they spun off the parking and rental car businesses and renamed the remaining company Warner Communications. And although the company has changed names several times, the Warner Brothers that we know today can be traced all the way back to the Kinney Parking Company. Interestingly enough, Steve Ross ended up being an incredibly talented businessman, turning Warner Brothers into a billion-dollar company and overseeing its eventual merger with Time. He was also extremely beloved in Hollywood, with Steven Spielberg even dedicating Schindler's List to him and saying, "Steve was very much what I wish my father was." You really can't praise a guy more than that. But Steve Ross never would have gotten the job if it weren't for the criminal activity of Manny Kimmel and Abner Zwillman. Now I know that story was a bit longy, but it was worth the wait for this next one. Coming in at number 4, we have Fanta, the orange soda manufactured by Coca-Cola. And for those of you who think it's pronounced Fanta, I'm sorry to tell you that you're wrong and you've always been wrong. The reason lies in the drink's origins, because many of you may not know that Fanta was invented in Nazi Germany. Now, Coca-Cola themselves have been accused of some dark things over the years, such as hiring a paramilitary group to murder union workers in Colombia, and the even worse sin of creating Dasani. But you might be happy to hear that Coke was not working with the Nazis like plenty of other companies. However, there was a corporate branch of Coke within Nazi Germany called Coca-Cola Deutschland. But when America joined the war in 1941, Coca-Cola Deutschland was cut off from Coca-Cola headquarters. The United States also began a trade embargo against the Nazis, meaning that the ingredients for Coke could no longer be sent to Germany. This was a big blow to Coca-Cola because the German plant was the most successful of their international branches at that time, after being built up by an American named Ray Rivington Powers. But despite having one of the sickest names of all time, Ray Powers died in a car crash in 1938. So with only 3 years of job experience, his successor was left in complete control of Coca-Cola Deutschland. The successor in question was a German businessman named Max Keith, which reportedly was pronounced Max Kite, although they really should have been calling him Max Flavor, because what he created next was truly remarkable. After being cut off, Max Kite managed to send a message to Coca-Cola headquarters through the neutral Coca-Cola Switzerland, telling them that he would do his best to keep the company's operations going through the war, which meant that he would have to find a way to create something that Coca-Cola Deutschland could continue to sell. So Max invented a new drink out of the few ingredients available in Germany at that time, including sugar beet, apple pumice, and whey, which is the liquid remaining after you turn milk into cheese. And as unappetizing as these ingredients sound, he found a way to turn them into Fanta. The name came from a brainstorming session that Max Kite had with his employees, where he told them to use their imagination to come up with a name. The German word for imagination is Fantasie, so one of the salesmen immediately suggested Fanta as the name of the soda. So the meeting was less of a brainstorm and more of a single drop of brain water. Fanta was an instant success, with 3 million cases being sold in 1943, although many Germans weren't even drinking it, instead using it to add flavor to their soups and stews in the midst of sugar rationing. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, Max Kite even taught the Fanta recipe to the Coca-Cola plant in Amsterdam. So you might be under fascist rule, but at least you get to enjoy a refreshing new beverage. Once the war was over, Coca-Cola regained contact with their German branch and were thrilled to find out that they were still going strong thanks to the sales of Fanta. They continued selling it until 1949, when the drink was discontinued. But it was revived in 1955 with a new formula, using the oranges that are a classic part of the drink we know today. For the record, Max Kite apparently refused to join the Nazi Party, which caused him some issues when it came to conducting business in Nazi Germany, but was ultimately a brilliant PR move for Coke in the grand scheme of things. Now that's a businessman with foresight. Still, it's no surprise that Coca-Cola doesn't exactly brag about the origin of Fanta, trying to distance themselves from the Nazis as much as possible. But at least the legacy of Max Kite is forever secured as the man who invented this delicious drink. And if you're from America and think that Fanta is disgusting, I suggest you try it anywhere else in the world, where it doesn't taste like the godless sugar water that they call Fanta in the US. You might even discover the answer to this vaguely offensive article titled, "Why Do Foreigners Like Fanta So Much?" At number 3, we've got Celestial Seasonings. Now, if you've never heard of this company, you might be more familiar with their signature product, Sleepy Time Tea, the herbal tea that has this tired and peaceful bear on the box. Not sure why he's sitting on an armchair listening to a radio from the 40s, but it does add something to the aesthetic. Unfortunately for that restful bear, the founder of Celestial Seasonings is an outspoken member of a racist cult. The company was started in 1969, when a man named Mo Siegel began gathering herbs in the Colorado Rocky Mountains and turning them into tea. He began selling the tea out of the back of his car with his friend and co-founder Wick Hay, who sounds like someone who was destined to sell herbs one way or another. Celestial Seasonings experienced rapid success, mostly due to the fact that it was the only company in the United States selling herbal tea. In 1972, they launched their signature Sleepy Time Tea. By 1974, they were already up to $1 million in sales. But beneath the company's herbal cushion lied the odd beliefs of Mo Siegel and Wick Hay, who were both big fans of the Urantia book, a 2,000-page spiritual book published around 1950. The author of the book is technically anonymous, although the book itself claims to be written by celestial beings. A lot of the Urantia book is similar to the teachings of most major religions, but it gets particularly spicy when it discusses the origins of our planet, which it calls Urantia. The book says that human life began on Urantia 500,000 years ago, when 6 races of different colors appeared: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and indigo. The book makes it clear that the blue race is white people, and it says that they are superior to the indigo race, which is supposed to be black people. It takes things up a notch when Adam and Eve arrive on Urantia. The book describes them as fair-skinned celestial beings who travel around the 10 million inhabited planets of the universe, breeding with certain inhabitants in order to eliminate inferior races and create, quote, one purified race. But in a shocking twist, the book reveals that Adam and Eve somehow failed to do this on our planet. And I guess they just kind of gave up and left. According to the book, the existence of these inferior races is the reason that disease and evil exist today. The book then encourages the reader to take matters into their own hands and, quote, work out your planetary problem of race improvement by other and largely human methods of adaptation and control. There are a bunch of other passages encouraging eugenics, but you get the gist. The Urantia book has collected a number of fans over the years, including Jimi Hendrix, who apparently carried it around with him everywhere. I have to assume he never got to the part about the indigo race. But an even bigger fan of the book is Mo Siegel, who supposedly based the entire company philosophy of Celestial Seasonings around the Urantia book. Wick Hay was also a fan of the book, but he was nowhere near as into it as Siegel, who went on to join an organization based on the book called the Urantia Foundation. Siegel has said that the book answered questions about Christianity by explaining the years of Jesus' life that are missing from the Bible. I guess Jesus spent those years in the lab trying to figure out a way to breed the right people to eliminate lactose intolerance. A former employee of Celestial Seasonings said that the Urantia book was a guide for making sure of the moral values that underlay the company at that time. Celestial Seasonings changed owners a few times over the years, with Siegel originally retiring in 1986, but he returned to the company in 1991 as their CEO and chairman, remaining with them until 2002, when he retired again to become the president of the Urantia Foundation. Now you could argue I'm being a bit harsh by calling the Urantia Foundation a cult, but it should be noted that the Urantia book specifically calls for the people of our planet to replace Christianity with, quote, a new cult, so I don't think I'm too far off here. Mo Siegel has also said that the Urantia book inspired the uplifting quotes that are written on the tags of Celestial Seasoning tea. So don't be surprised if the next time you're preparing to go to bed, your tea tells you that we must secure the future of the blue race at all costs. At number 2, we have the luxury fashion brand Chanel. With a present-day revenue of over $15 billion, Chanel is one of the largest sellers of luxury goods in the world. The brand's founder, Gabrielle Coco Chanel, is widely considered one of the most influential fashion designers of all time. But declassified documents have recently revealed that when she wasn't building her brand, Coco Chanel was a secret agent for the Nazi Party. Coco entered the fashion world in 1909, when she opened a hat shop in Paris on the property of French businessman Etienne Balsan, who she was the mistress of. One thing you have to understand about Coco Chanel is that she was a rather promiscuous woman. I'm not trying to shame her here, except about the Nazi stuff, of course, but a lot of her life story has to do with her many affairs, flings, and relationships. But by all accounts, she seems to have used these entanglements to her advantage. In 1910, Chanel opened a new, independent hat shop a couple miles away, funded by English polo player Arthur Boy Capel, who Chanel was also the mistress of. Capel later died in a car accident on his way to meet up with Chanel, which has to be the worst possible outcome of a booty call. After World War I, the Chanel brand really began to thrive, thanks to the popularity of the perfume Chanel No. 5. In 1924, Coco Chanel made a deal with French businessman Pierre Wertheimer to expand the business, although it left Coco with only 10% of the Chanel ownership. Still, it made her some good money as she continued to design products. But everything changed when Nazi Germany invaded France in 1940. With Paris under German occupation, Coco Chanel decided that if you can't beat the Nazis, become a Nazi. She began a relationship with Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a German aristocrat who was working as a spy for the German intelligence agency known as the Abwehr. The relationship allowed her to live at the Hotel Ritz in Paris, where high-ranking Nazi soldiers stayed. And this was when Coco Chanel really began to flex her Nazi muscles. Since Pierre Wertheimer was Jewish, he fled to New York when the Nazis invaded France. Angry about only owning 10% of her company, Coco Chanel petitioned German officials to grant her sole ownership, since the company was, quote, still the property of Jews. But what she didn't know was that before fleeing the country, Pierre Wertheimer had temporarily handed over his ownership of the company to a Christian friend of his, which prevented Coco from taking it. But don't worry, Coco found a way to be even more of a Nazi by working with them directly. Like her boyfriend, she also became a member of the Abwehr, even receiving an agent number and the codename Westminster. And Westminster Chanel found herself involved in two notable Nazi operations. The first one saw her accompany a Nazi officer to Madrid in 1941, where she introduced him to some of her powerful friends in the Allied forces so he could attempt to recruit them as spies for the Nazis. Not exactly the scheme of the century, but I guess there was only so much she could do. In 1943, the Nazis again called upon their fascist fashionista friend. The secret agent couple, Coco Chanel and Hans Gunther von Dinklage, traveled to Berlin to meet with their military superior, General Walter Schellenberg of the SS, who Coco Chanel had also reportedly slept with at some point. The three of them devised a plan called Operation Model Hat, named after the hats that Chanel had started her career making. The mission involved Chanel writing a letter to her old friend Winston Churchill. Don't worry, as far as we know, they never slept together. The letter was supposed to convince Churchill to negotiate a peace treaty with the SS behind Hitler's back. The plan was to send it to Churchill via the British Embassy in Madrid. But the letter never managed to reach him, which is why we don't remember Coco Chanel as the woman who single-handedly ended World War II. After the war, Coco was arrested in Paris for collaborating with the Nazis, but she was released after only a few hours. It's rumored that her friend Winston Churchill personally intervened to have her freed. And if he was willing to do her that big of a favor, maybe they did sleep together. Since Coco Chanel wasn't exactly beloved in France on account of the Nazi stuff, she and Hans Gunther von Dinklage fled to Switzerland, where she continued her career as a well-respected fashion icon. She even went on to pay for the living expenses and medical bills of Walter Schellenberg for the rest of his life. She really did love those Nazis. Today, Chanel is entirely owned by the grandchildren of Pierre Wertheimer, making it the only company that Jews and Nazis can both find a reason to boycott or support. And at number 1, we have good old Chiquita, the largest distributor of bananas in the United States. And you might know some of this already, but you probably don't know exactly how bad it is. Over the course of its existence, Chiquita has worked with terrorists, cartels, and dictatorships to help their business. And they basically caused a civil war, too. Chiquita Brands International traces its roots all the way back to 1870, when an American sailor named Lorenzo Dow Baker brought bananas from Jamaica to the US. Everyone loved the bananas so much that Baker decided to follow in the footsteps of American entrepreneurs and create an evil international corporation. Chiquita was originally known as the Boston Fruit Company, but became the United Fruit Company in 1899. The company even had their own maritime flag, which I must begrudgingly admit is sick as hell. Throughout the early 20th century, they rapidly expanded their operations in Central and South America. They did this with the help of the US government, who conducted military occupations in Central America on behalf of American fruit companies in a collection of conflicts now known as the Banana Wars. Still, the United Fruit Company's first real scandal didn't come until 1928, when their plantation workers in Colombia went on strike, demanding better pay and working conditions. The company refused to cooperate until the Colombian government decided to handle the issue themselves by sending in the military. And the military proceeded to slaughter the workers, with the number of reported deaths ranging up to 2,000. The event is now known as the Banana Massacre. And Chiquita is probably glad that social media didn't exist at the time, otherwise they might have had to issue a weak apology and make a donation to the Colombian American Chamber of Commerce. But instead, United Fruit Company continued to treat their plantation workers horribly. In the late 40s, their workers in Guatemala also tried going on strike, and the company again refused to negotiate. But the government of Guatemala took the side of their citizens, and in 1952 they began giving away unused land owned by the United Fruit Company to Guatemalan peasants. As you can imagine, the company was not happy, so they responded the reasonable way and lobbied the US government to have the president of Guatemala overthrown. It helped that the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his brother Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, had both previously represented United Fruit Company in court. So the company's lobbying worked like a charm, as Eisenhower authorized the CIA to launch a coup in Guatemala, forcing the president into exile and establishing a pro-business military dictatorship in his place. The new dictator restricted the human rights of Guatemalans and tortured his political opponents, resulting in a civil war that lasted 36 years and killed up to 200,000 people. But hey, at least an American banana company didn't have to give their employees a raise. In 1990, the company was officially renamed Chiquita, probably trying to distance themselves from the bad press of single-handedly causing the largest military conflict in the history of a country. Unfortunately for Chiquita, they immediately found themselves involved in another controversy, which was once again completely their fault. This one took place in Honduras, where a banana shortage was threatening Chiquita's profits. Meanwhile, the rival banana company Fife's was expanding their operations in the country, and Chiquita didn't take too kindly to that. So they acted in classic Chiquita fashion and began illegally seizing and destroying Fife's shipments, ultimately destroying $10 million worth of produce. Then the company bribed judges to sign off on detention orders for Fife's ships. An executive at Fife's even accused Chiquita of falsifying an arrest warrant in an attempt to kidnap him, which led to a lengthy court battle. But as we know, all of this is pretty much just a regular Tuesday for Chiquita. In 1998, a reporter at the Cincinnati Enquirer actually hacked into Chiquita's voicemail system and published allegations that the company was bribing foreign officials, evading foreign laws, and facilitating the transport of cocaine on their ships. But Chiquita sued the Cincinnati Enquirer over the hacking, getting the newspaper to retract the story, publicly apologize, and pay Chiquita over $10 million in settlement fees. And it turns out Chiquita needed that money to pay off a terrorist group. From the 90s to early 2000s, Chiquita was sending money to a Colombian paramilitary and drug trafficking organization known as the United Self-Defenders of Colombia, a name that directly contradicts itself. Chiquita has since claimed that the group was extorting them and threatening to attack their facilities if the company didn't pay. But Chiquita was also allowing the United Self-Defenders to use their loading facilities to help transport AK-47s, so they were a bit more involved with them than just a few extortion payments. Over the course of 10 years, Chiquita paid the group $1.7 million, including $300,000 being sent after the US Department of Justice had told Chiquita to stop paying the organization. Chiquita reportedly also paid off 2 other paramilitary groups as early as 1987. The company has since been fined $25 million by the DOJ, and they've had to pay even more in settlement fees with the families of people that the United Self-Defenders murdered. But somehow it doesn't even crack the top 3 scandals that this incredibly evil company has been involved in. And that concludes our list of 5 companies with surprisingly dark pasts. Let me know in the comments which one was the most surprising. Or you can brag about how you already knew all of these and they weren't surprising at all. But I'm hoping they were at least interesting. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have made it to the end of this incredibly long video. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll make you drink American Fanta instead of the good stuff they make in Nazi Germany.